Okay, we'll have a quick recap of what we covered last week. So we have a quick read of these sentences and see if you can remember how we would finish these sentences off based on what we talked about last week. Okay, let's see if you were right. So brains are built and not born. They develop very rapidly over the first years of childhood. The whole of the early years is a sensitive phase for the development of executive function. And we talked a little bit about how there is that particularly rapid development between the ages of 4 and 5 when executive function really increases at a stage that is not preceded in the same way, and it will not happen again. We talked about how we need to think about how we weave these approaches into our provision. So it's not really a case of a kind of distinct lesson in self-regulation or executive function. We talked about how it's a kind of thread that runs through everything that we do in the early years foundation stage. We talked about the importance of self-regulation development, particularly for children who are coming from low-income backgrounds because of the impacts of poverty on child's health and development. But we also talked about the critical role that parents play and what they do is much more important than the income that they have, of course. And so we need to develop narratives that avoid blame or deficit thinking and look for the advantages and the opportunities with the communities that we work with. And we talked a lot about the kind of challenges and complexities of self-regulation, but also really tried to look at that positive side of the difference that we can make through our practice and our partnership with parents. At the end of the last session, I asked you to have a look at the Early Education Endowment Foundation's guidance report on self-regulation and metacognition. And I wanted to give you a chance now to go into breakout groups for just kind of 5 minutes, in particular, to have a think about how the language of self-regulation and metacognition is important. One of the things that really struck me when I read the report in Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning was that the way that people use self-regulation and metacognition as terms really varies from phase to phase. So, and probably from school to school and classroom to classroom. So I thought it would be useful to spend 5 minutes in breakout groups, having a quick discussion. What do these words mean to you? How do you use the terms self-regulation and metacognition in your setting? As I said, we have a relatively big group today, so it might take a moment or two to send you into your breakout groups, and we'll call you back in about 5 minutes' time. Hi, welcome back. I hope that was useful to take a moment to reflect on the way that we use language when we talk about self-regulation and metacognition. And as you will see in the early years foundation stage guidance, also the term executive function as well, just to add some more terminology in there for us. We were having some conversations last week with the colleagues at Pedal Centre in Cambridge about how important it is that we build a kind of shared understanding of the vocabulary that we're using, because from one day, one setting or one conversation to the next, terms like self-regulation, metacognition, executive function can be used in different ways. I think last week we talked a little bit, some people had questions about how self-regulation can be conflated with behavior management, for example, in some conversations, which isn't what we mean when we're talking about self-regulation. But it is really important to draw out those distinctions. So in the early years foundation stage, statutory guidance now, self-regulation and executive function has its own early learning goal for the first time, which means that we do all need to be able to talk about children's progress within these areas and what we're doing to support them. But I think it also helps us to pin down what it means for us in our context. So the language that is used in the guidance, this is from the Development Matters guidance, clearly links self-regulation and executive function to the competencies that children need to develop for learning, for their attention, for their information processing, lots of things that are connected to specific areas in the early years foundation stage, communication and language, literacy, and so on, but also links to the behavioural and emotional development that we know is so critical over this time period. I think it's also really clear when you look at the breakdown like this, that the early learning goal isn't something that's distinct, that sits on its own, that self-regulation and executive function is a set of boxes that you can tick, or a thing that can be achieved independently, but that it is clearly interwoven and connected across the broader areas of learning in the early years. And I think I feel as a practitioner, like that's the case for everything. You can't have your maths development without your communication and language, or your personal, social, and emotional development. But I think that since this is a new area that has been brought in, it is a slight risk of being treated as a kind of an area in isolation, a distinct and new thing, when really it is something that lots of us have been doing and thinking about and talking about as part of everything for a really long time. So you know, all of those things that you're doing in any interaction with children in your setting, thinking about how they are managing their own impulsive behavior, how they are focusing their attention, how they're concentrating, planning, being patient, and being resilient. I think all of those things are things that we work on a day-to-day basis in our settings. And I also think that it comes through. Last week, Professor Baker talked about how self-regulation, as she conceives of it in her cognitive science work, as connected to the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. And I know that Julian often talks about the characteristics of effective teaching and learning as a golden thread that run through all of the areas of learning in the early years foundation stage. And I also feel that it's very clear when you think about watching children who are developing in the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, playing and exploring, that process of kind of investigating and experiencing the iterative element of active learning, the focus and the attention and the planning and evaluation that's involved in creating and thinking critically. It's really clear that self-regulation and executive function also underpin and cut through the characteristics of effective teaching and learning as well. We have got lots of really lovely videos to show you today, so I'm not going to show you the video that is linked to at the bottom here now, but like everything else, it will be on the Padlet. And I just wanted to highlight it for you because for those of you who haven't used Siren Films, there is footage on there of children demonstrating or developing the characteristics of effective teaching and learning as part of their free to access resources. So you can access Siren Films with a subscription, which is free for a certain time, but they also have a really lovely set of videos, which are really great for reflecting on your practice, on your interaction, and on what you observe outside of the really busy context of observing your own children in your own setting, and thinking about how playing and exploring, active learning, creating and thinking critically work, and how self-regulation and executive function relate to those and what you might do in those contexts. So I did just want to draw your attention to that as a resource to use as you think about executive function and self-regulation. But now Fliss is going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of self-regulation when it comes to communication and language in particular.
Thanks, Polly. Hi, everybody. So yeah, let's think a bit about language development. So we know that language development is absolutely central to self-regulation. And it's because this is enabling children to guide their actions and plans. And if you think about how children engage in pretend play and how they utilize their language, that's really powerful as well, because it's giving children many opportunities to really kind of focus their thinking, for them to really kind of persevere, persist, and start to plan ahead. And that's really interesting. Additionally, within the EEF guidance, Preparing for Literacy, one of the recommendations around that guidance is about trying to embed opportunities to develop self-regulation. So actually, when you think about it from both of those angles, so language development is central to self-regulation, but also if we're thinking about early literacy as well, and we know about how crucial early language development is to literacy, and how we can then embed self-regulation into that process as well. It's really, really powerful and really interesting, because children's self-regulation skills affect their ability to manage their own behavior and aspects of their learning. So actually, those children who can self-regulate effectively are likely to be able to motivate themselves to engage in learning and use those strategies to help themselves learn, as well as control all those difficult emotions. And the key thing around language is that not only can adults support children to develop their ability to self-regulate by explicitly articulating their own thinking, but also children can be encouraged to really articulate their own thinking. And that's really important, isn't it? When you think about that central role of being able to really express oneself and really be able to articulate feelings, thoughts, emotions, plans and ideas, to imagine, to speculate and hypothesize. Really, really powerful. And something that we do an awful lot at Sheringham Nursery School is think about how to, I guess someone might refer to it as sort of emotional literacy in terms of language, giving children the words to describe how they're feeling so they can start to regulate those emotions. And that's something that we do an awful lot, and we use those zones of regulation where children can start to really think about how they're feeling, and also have adults model all that rich language to help them really understand how to label it and how to articulate it. Really, really powerful. Now, in terms of language development, it's also really worth considering about non-verbal communication as well, and how gesture can also support self-regulation, particularly with much younger children. And there is some sort of interesting kind of research looking into how that happens, what that looks like for young children, for pre-verbal children. Using gestures and those pre-linguistic vocalizations can be a tool for self-regulation as well. So we're going to have a look at a really lovely little video of a little girl called Sky. And what we want you to really kind of think about is how Sky is supported by the adult that she's engaging with. And really for you to be thinking about both language and self-regulation and how that interaction is supporting both of those really, really crucial things. Thanks, Polly.
Look, Sky, look inside. Very pretty.
How's that?
It looks like a jewel.
Find some more.
Find some more. Find some more.
That treasure.
We could put our treasure inside there.
And a fit.
That one doesn't fit, no.
That fit.
Have a try then.
Wow.
Wow! Fantastic!
You damn. Wow.
Have a feel.
Love a feel.
Yeah? It's lovely and smooth. Oh, you're putting eyes on, okay. One eye. Oh, a nose, okay.
Then we have to know the treasure.
We just need to find out because when
So a really lovely little clip of Sky, who is 2 years old, with her educator exploring those natural materials. And so just for a moment, just have a think about, well, how might that relationship and that use of language support Sky's self-regulation? So pop your ideas in the chat, and if anybody wants to also unmute and share some thoughts, please feel free to. Have a think about how that interaction, how that language use supports Sky's self-regulation. We're echoing back so she can hear her thinking. The teacher voice, yeah, voicing Sky's thinking, repeating back what she said, encouraging her to have a go. Yeah, absolutely. Keeping her motivated. So it's asking those questions again. So it's really supporting her language development. Yeah, so she can engage with those resources. Modeling new words, giving her time to think and process. Yeah, extending that language, absolutely. Because Sky is at that point, you know, with sort of 2-year-olds, it's such a sort of rapid explosion of language, isn't there? And actually, you know, from that sort of 22 to 28 months, you know, children continue to kind of improve their communicative and symbolic skills. And so increasing that vocabulary is going to help them gain better understanding and help them to express themselves and cope with all those difficult emotions. So yeah, absolutely. Tuning in and enjoying the activity. Formulating full sentences. Yeah, so we know again, it's rooted in all that lovely kind of co-regulation as well, isn't it? Yeah, so she knows that we want that what she's saying is valued, that's interesting, and that we want to hear that conversation. Absolutely. So you can see just how powerful it is. And this is a very, very young child. And actually, as children's language develops and as their kind of cognitive skills develop, you know, that use of language will shift as well. There will be more emphasis on adults encouraging children to articulate their own thinking and to really kind of guide their actions and plans, and to really start to kind of, you know, reflect on their own learning as well. Absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone to contributing in the chat. Some really, really good comments there. So I'm just going to move us on to the next section, which is a bit about metacognition. And we're going to be thinking about this in relation to how this connects to being a self-regulated learner. So as you can see here, you know, we've got this, you know, it's as Polly was saying, what's really interesting about this is that we've got to kind of consider the terminology that we're using and really reflect on what that means. So metacognition and self-regulation are very, very closely related, and that self-regulated learning can be broken down into these three kind of components. So you've got that cognition, so all those mental processes that's involved in knowing, understanding and learning. Then the metacognition, you know, that sort of learning to learn, that sort of awareness of one's own thinking and learning. And then also motivation, so a willingness to engage in our own sort of metacognitive and cognitive skills. And it's interesting, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine earlier who is I will say, an expert in metacognition and mathematical thinking with much older children. And she just sort of said, when we were having a conversation today, thinking about it in relation to maths, well, actually, you also need to kind of consider self-concept. So do you believe you can? Because that impacts upon motivation as well. And so I was sort of thinking about that in relation to an early years context, and how, again, that lovely supportive relationship, the adult down at the child's level, the echoing back, valuing, validating what Sky is saying in that context. You know, like, she'd been given all these kind of can-do kind of messages. I mean, you know, in that instance, that's a really lovely kind of sort of pace of learning where they're exploring, and there's no sort of real external demands, but actually she's still getting all those messages, isn't she, you know, about who she is and how that adult respects her in that process. And I think that that's really interesting and something to kind of really consider. So thinking about metacognition, I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that was carried out at Sheringham Nursery School. So I'm based at Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre in East London in Newham, and very lucky to work with a really knowledgeable team. And my colleague Tanya Chowdhury, who is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator and also Evidence Lead in Education for the East London Research School, was really fascinated by some work that was carried out and reported in the Impact Journal with some slightly older children looking at metacognition. And so she decided to replicate this study that was carried out at our nursery school. So as you can see from that title, you know, a diverse nursery school in East London. So a majority of our children speak English as an additional language. You know, it's you know, we're in quite a disadvantaged area, and so she was just really kind of interested in, well, what does that look like for us here? And also, we have 3- and 4-year-old children, and this particular study was with slightly older children. And one of the kind of key sort of, I guess, myths that's kind of come out of the EEF report on self-regulation and metacognition is this idea that young children aren't able to sort of think metacognitively. And we talked a bit about that last week, about that research carried out by David Whitebread, you know, who really kind of explored 3- to 5-year-olds. So this is really interesting. And obviously I know the children that were involved in this study. So it was quite fascinating to kind of see how Tanya approached this, and also kind of reflect just on my personal knowledge of those children and see the process, sort of the progress that they went through in terms of their own thinking as well. So she used something called video stimulated reflective dialogue, observations, group discussions, and drawings as well to support the children. And it's really interesting. So she's using video to ask children questions as well. And I would have loved to have been able to show you some of the little clips that we have of the children. But unfortunately, we didn't have the right sort of sharing permissions. But we've got some excerpts, sort of written excerpts on the next few slides that capture the children's thinking. But what was really interesting was that the children, over the course of the year, the children were able to talk more specifically about thinking in different contexts. They could notice when other children were engaging in thinking. And I think that was really interesting, because they noticed when other children, they noticed when they were engaged in metacognitive processes and were able to combine their own metacognitive knowledge with that metacognitive regulation. So where the children had initially required, sorry, Polly, if you could just go back one slide. quite a lot of instruction. Tanya very much scaffolded this, but by the end of that process of that year, she kind of gradually weaned them away from this input, and they become way more independent in their thinking. And so initially, what was really interesting was that a lot of the children had this belief that thinking was related to praying, or how that connected to predicting something that happens in a story. That's really interesting. So much more sophisticated thinking emerged. What is also interesting is that Lewis, who'd carried out the initial study, and some other researchers in the field, had kind of reflected on oracy skills and whether the development of language might stand as a barrier to understanding how children can think metacognitively. But what was really interesting in this instance, all these children, English as an additional language, it didn't seem to come through for us in that way. So here's a little excerpt on the next slide about a child who really is kind of describing what she's seeing one of her friends do. I'll just, sort of reading it out is just great, because actually you hear this child's voice. It's that whole idea of like, oh, she's narrating what's happening. She's making a mask. I think it's a mask. It kind of looks like one. And she's thinking about what to do next. She looks a bit stuck. Oh, she's trying to use the glue. I don't think that's going to work. And she's hilarious. See, she's thinking about what to do next. Oh, look, she's using the tape now. That's a better idea. That's good thinking. I would have used the tape. So can you see in the richness of just that little excerpt about a child who's gone through this process with Tanya, like really exploring their own thinking, and Tanya modeling that language of thinking. So like when you look in the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, you can see some of that vocabulary that's really powerful to use, and that we need to use it with our youngest children and give that to them. And I think that's really interesting, where she's noticing what the child is doing. She's commenting on her peers' thinking skills, and also about thinking what to do next and whether it's a good idea. And she's also reflecting as well on what she would have done in that instance. So the next slide just shows another example again. And again, note this use of the child using, I was thinking. So I was thinking when I made that house with the Duplo. First, I made a roof, but it didn't stay. So I had to think what to do next. I changed it and made it with the long pieces instead. I was doing thinking. So the children really kind of articulating this beautifully. And, that how exciting it is to see these young children being able to, with that rich scaffolding and that input from a knowledgeable other, how we can really extend their language, their thinking, and how that's going to help them with their learning, how that's going to help them become self-regulated learners. Because actually, if they can articulate what they're thinking and what they want to do, and if they're frustrated, or what their ideas are, then actually that's just going to help them be able to emotionally regulate so much more. But obviously, we need to kind of be thinking about all those dimensions of self-regulation, that emotional regulation, that cognitive regulation, really important, and that behavioral regulation, and how metacognition kind of really ties into that. So we're going to have another look at another video. And this video is, again, another young child who is she is a 2-year-old, she's very articulate, and she's had quite a tricky experience earlier in the day where there's been a thunderstorm. And she's basically spending time with her key person, really kind of, just kind of trying to work her through this process. So we're going to have a quick look at this video. It's really nice. And again, be thinking all the time about how that adult is supporting.
Would you like to hear the story? Do you know what it's called? The snail and the whale. And then they go to a place undersea. Sharks under the sea.
We have sharks, Eve.
We do have sharp teeth.
But
That's true.
babies don't have sharp teeth. But when they get bigger. When I was small, I didn't have teeth.
No, you wouldn't, like when you were born. And then they grow. Not all of these creatures have sharp
I
teeth.
want to get food so I can get pedals. I'm waiting to get food. What are these?
What are you looking at?
This.
My sandals?
This. Oh no!
That's my leg. Like this is a leg.
Like, this is a leg.
Like that's a leg. There's not many creatures that have legs in this picture.
Yeah.
I can see one with claws. I think that's a lobster.
Goats have that.
Goats have legs. Do sharks have legs? No.
Wings. Wings.
Fins. Fins. Do starfishes have legs?
No. Yes, look.
What about sea urchins? Do they have legs? Okay, where are they going next? They've been to the jungle, under the sea, to...
Land Slayton!
This is the one you were telling me about. Oops. Not there.
No,
Okay. So the water looks very calm. There's no rain coming.
Yes?
And there it comes. It makes a start. And look at the lightning in the sky. And the waves crashing against the rocks. They're not flat anymore. They're crashing. Look, the whale's going a bit further down into the sea. Do you think he's hiding? Do you think the whale likes thunder? Yeah?
No.
No? I think he doesn't. What about snail? Does snail like thunder? No?
But snails don't like thunder.
Don't they?
But parrots like thunder.
Parrots? Some people like thunder.
I know.
Do you like thunder, Dong?
Not when I was sleeping.
Ah, not when she's sleeping.
But it's daytime, I don't mind.
But big ones like thunder.
Do you mean grown-ups? Some do, some don't,
But
Heidi.
little ones don't. But we're still little. But we have got teeth. Growing up.
And when you're grown up more, do you think you might like thunder more? No, it's not going to change your mind. Like you've
Stop.
grown your teeth.
Stop.
It has stopped. It's moved on somewhere else. Stopped here. Has it stopped in our pictures? If I turn it over, has it stopped?
Yeah, there's no thunder.
No, there's no thunder here. There is a very big
Big
brown
bear.
bear.
And big.
So really, I just think that clip's a brilliant one to think about when we're kind of thinking about difficult emotions, but also language and how that adult really supports that self-regulation and metacognition. So just for a few moments, have a think and pop your ideas in the chat. You know, how did that sort of interaction again support this child, having had this tricky sort of experience with the thunder earlier in the day? How did that help her self-regulation and her metacognitive thinking? Yeah, absolutely. Allows her to reflect on an emotional experience in a safer context. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and relating those sort of her own advice and experiences in the book, and picking her experience, thinking about other viewpoints. So again, that's helping really kind of support children's sort of to manage all those thoughts and emotions. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, do you know, it's okay not to like thunder. Yeah. Yeah. And she's also kind of challenging her thinking. Absolutely. So it's really kind of supporting her emotionally, but enabling her again to kind of think through and reflect. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, something that really strikes me when I think about that clip is the sort of concept of sustained shared thinking as well, which we touched on last week, and that idea of, you know, two people kind of sort of working together intellectually to clarify something, extend an idea, develop a narrative. And actually what that practitioner is doing for that child, you know, is creating that very sort of safe environment, but also kind of challenging her thinking through all those strategies. And you know, in terms of very, very young children, that kind of metacognition can kind of be very much sort of fostered and enabled by the adults through that power of conversation. You know, sort of being able to kind of really use that language, very much like how Tanya did with the children, thinking about what they were doing as well. So it's really interesting to kind of reflect on that. And I think these videos are really powerful to show us just that role of the adults for very young children, and encouraging them to really think through all these experiences. And that sort of excellent practice that's highlighted, you know, by things like the sustained shared thinking and emotional well-being scale as well, really does highlight that too. The point is that we know that there are practices that encourage children to reflect. So reflect on how things happen, how they do things, really, really crucial. And so really kind of encouraging that dialogue is going to make a really big difference to children's thinking and learning and language development. Okay, so move on to the next slide. And Polly's going to kind of come back to thinking about play and playful contexts and how powerful play is for really supporting all of these crucial aspects of self-regulated learning and metacognitive thinking.
Thank you. Some really helpful, tangible examples there. So yeah, as Fliss said, I wanted to bring this back a little bit to the play that we know is the cornerstone of much of our work in our settings in early years foundation stage. The Education Endowment Foundation's report into self-regulation and metacognition doesn't bring lots of play into it. And in the early years toolkit, there is a section on play, which we'll refer to in a moment. But it is an area where I think we recognise that the Education Endowment Foundation's research can be kind of supplemented by some additional reports and support. And this article, or this report, this document, I suppose, that I'm sharing with you here, is a collaboration between UNICEF and the Lego Foundation, which draws together the work of a series of research reports that were completed in collaboration between Professor David Whitebread and his research group in Cambridge, Jennifer Zosch and her research group in Harvard, and the people who work for the Lego Foundation and their research centres in various different places in the world as well. So it's a really exciting set of research reports that you can access. They're all free to access through the Lego Foundation website. They include kind of meta-analyses as well as closer studies. And this report, the Learning Through Play document, is a much more visual, much more, it's not a research report, it's not a meta-analysis, it's a very nice visual, lovely document that is really useful actually if you want to think about how you're developing strategies for play in your setting. because it's useful to refer to with specialists and non-specialists alike. If, like me, you've been a reception teacher in a school where lots of your senior leadership team don't have early years experience, then it's also a really useful document and something that you can share with parents when you want to talk to them about play and what that looks like when it's developing self-regulation as well. So this report defines play with 5 key characteristics: that it's meaningful, actively engaging, joyful, iterative, and socially interactive. And think that if you think about play in that conceptualization, obviously there are many other ways to conceptualize play. If you conceptualize play like that, I think it's really easy to see the direct connection between play and self-regulated learning. The engagement aspect of it, being actively engaged, is really critical for the development of self-regulation. Meaning making, play is meaningful, and the making of meaning, the kind of cognitive processes and the metacognitive processes that you use when you're making meaning out of your experiences are really powerful during play. The iteration component, the one that I always fall back on, I think, is that, you know, you're making a tower, it falls down, or someone knocks it down, or, you know, you make it a bit too tall to start with. You go back and you start again, and you repeat that process. You iterate, learning each time what's going to make it more effective, whether that is making your base stronger or keeping it away from the child who knocked it down in the first time around. But that social interaction component is also really important for the development of self-regulation, and that the role that other people have in your learning, that other children have in your learning and your play, is also really critical. The reports, as I mentioned, that feed into this do delve into some lovely depth into the different areas of self-regulation, metacognition, emotional regulation, executive function, and explore how specific types of play can also support the development of each of these different cognitive and metacognitive processes. That said, the play in and of itself can be very powerful for self-regulation development, but there are also things that we can do to make it more powerful, and I think it's really important for us to think about our role in that. So those components of it, the kind of the iterative, joyful components, are critical themselves, but then there's also this element of challenge, the perfect level of challenge, and know that Sarah referred to it last week, I think, as the Goldilocks moment. So it's not too hot, not too cold. It's just right. It's just enough challenge for us to be developing our self-regulatory and metacognitive skills. And some of the ways that we can do that we talked about last week. Fliss talked in some lovely detail about sustained shared thinking, talked about co-regulation, and Sarah, I think, also talked about co-regulation last week as well. One of the things that I just wanted to flag up again when we talk about self-regulation and play is using the plan, do, review model when we support children in their play-based learning in our settings. So I'm sure that many of you use this model. It's a way of encouraging children to think about what they're going to do when they play, to monitor what they're doing while they're playing, and to reflect on their play afterwards. And that's very broadly aligned to ways that we would support the development of metacognitive and self-regulatory skills later on in primary or secondary education as well. But it can work very effectively with play-based learning, in particular for younger children. So again, the EEF Toolkit references this as a particular strategy that can be used in the early years to develop self-regulation, recognizing the value of this approach for improving the impact of play. And I think connecting that as well to what Fliss was saying with regards to children's language development, one of the things that I have found very powerful in using plan, do, review in my own context is that it gives children that language, much as Tanya gave children the language of thinking when she was developing that with them, giving them that language of, well, what are you going to do next, and why are you going to do that, and how are you going to approach it? What will you need? Where will you go? Will you need me to help you? Will you do it by yourself? What will you do if you get stuck? And having the children having the opportunity through either sustained shared thinking or in fact much shorter interactions with adults as well, whilst they are engaging in their play, in the process of their iterations, you know, supporting children not to give up and to kind of work through any challenges that they're facing, as well as reflecting afterwards. And one of the lovely things that Fliss reported in Tanya's research is where children are able to reflect on other children's learning as well. And if you embed and scaffold the plan, do, review process over the course of the year, you can see at the end of it children beginning to you know, reflect collaboratively. Children have developed that language of what they could have done differently. It's very difficult. I think if you ask, you know, a 3 or a 4-year-old at the beginning of the year, what could you have done differently to make that better? There's all kinds of like conditional statements in there for them to understand, but also, you know, the concept that they could try something differently next time. But all of that language and that conversation happening gradually over a period of time supports children not only to kind of observe and engage in the development of self-regulation and metacognitive skills, but also to develop the language with which to talk about it, which in turn helps them to build up their capacity for using those skills later on as well. And in fact, that some of these concepts are some of the reasons why the self-regulation has been articulated in the way that it has in the early years foundation stage, because this is a phase in which developing that critical language, developing those critical skills through play can be particularly powerful. I also just really want to be clear that when we're talking about supporting children in developing their self-regulation through play, we are in no way talking about reducing their agency during play. And as I think Sarah argued last week, and as she does in some of her work that you'll be able to access through the Padlet, supporting children to develop greater agency is a critical component of both play-based learning and the development of self-regulation through play that they engage in. And I think it can be really helpful for us when we reflect on our own engagement and our own interactions with children during their learning, to think about what level of agency we are affording children, what we're doing to give them the maximum opportunity to have that Goldilocks moment, to have all of the right support in place through their environment or their adults, or the challenge that we support them with, but where their agency in how to approach their learning, how to approach their play, who they're interacting with, is still very much a core to what they're doing. So developing that language, developing that agency, and carefully scaffolding experiences so that children can develop their self-regulatory skills through play, as well as through the modelling and interactions that we have talked about so far as well. Fliss and I have both given you some kind of practical functional experiences of developing self-regulation in our settings, and the evidence for developing self-regulation through the curriculum areas of communication and language and preparing for literacy, through thinking specifically about developing metacognition and metacognitive language, and also through play-based learning. And since we have kind of downloaded such a huge amount of information in the last kind of 25 minutes of the session, hoped it would be useful to give you some time again in breakout groups. I think that we've got time for probably about 10 minutes in breakout groups to have a good conversation. And at this point, I think it would be really helpful to think about what are you doing when it comes to self-regulation development already in these areas, when it comes to communication and language, a specific and directed focus on metacognition or through play? What are you doing that you can celebrate that is fantastic already? And where are there opportunities that you've identified from the conversations that we've had so far, that things that you might want to take forward? So we'll put you into breakout groups, give you about 10 minutes to discuss those topics, and then we will come back to reflect on where we can take this next.
is is actually quite empowering, isn't it? We kind of step back and kind of go, okay, we're doing some really amazing things for our children. We're doing things that actually are evidence-based. And so that opportunity to hear from others and to share all this information is, yeah, can be reassuring and empowering. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, actually, that a lot of the time in our our careful interactions with children in early years, we are working on self-regulation, and we know that we're doing it. I think that the introduction of the early learning goal in particular has encouraged people to really focus on it and maybe question their security of knowledge about it. So hopefully it is something that is empowering for people. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
That's okay. We've got some other really great comments here talking about how having time with children, this is it, space and time, making that space and time is really, really important, because we want them to show us what is, it's so valuable in dedicating that time to have those rich conversations that are going to promote all of this development. Sarah, we discussed how we promote self-regulation, agency in EYFS, how this seems to change as children do move up school. And yeah, there are challenges with that, but actually if we can lay those foundations, if we can really instill so many of these really important developmental kind of dispositions and attitudes and skills, that's going to really equip children as well. Self-regulation, Karina is saying self-regulation is something that can be built through reflection on behaviour, embedded through routines, absolutely. And Jackie acknowledging that every setting is so varied and that people will be at different stages in their journey. And that's important to acknowledge, isn't it? We're all kind of constantly learning and reflecting, and we have to remember that we are in our unique kind of settings and contexts, absolutely. But yeah, as Julie says, makes us think about how much we're doing already without realising we're doing it. And I was thinking about this earlier because I think it's about us as educators becoming metacognitive ourselves, isn't it? Being intentional about what we do and reflecting on all of these things and thinking about, oh, okay, now I know a bit more about how to support children's self-regulation. I can be quite intentional about it and be proud of doing all of these things that maybe I was doing sort of, I don't know, sort of intrinsically, but actually didn't quite realize just how much I was already doing. And just the last few comments as well, thinking about things like consistency, use of clear instructions, absolutely. Inviting other children to view learning, talk about what we have learned, absolutely. Again, that review process, and just spending time, is really important. Embedding all of these kind of key aspects of self-regulation. Really important to really consider. And just one last point from Hannah here, good to take the time to consider that we are currently supporting children with their self-regulation, but about assigning a shared language that's going to support that practice and encourage greater understanding. Definitely. Valuing play, sustained shared thinking. Yes. Thank you so much for all your comments.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. And thank you for engaging in that time to reflect and consider what we have been talking about so far. In the last 5 minutes, I just want to highlight the Early Years Toolkit to you. It's accessible on the Education Endowment Foundation website, and it includes some specific resources for self-regulation strategies, but it also is very interesting to explore specific curriculum areas for the additional references to self-regulation. So if you go into the part of the Early Years Toolkit that talks about language, for example, or literacy, you will see that there are quite often references to how self-regulation can specifically support that area. And I think we're very explicit when we talk about metacognition in later stages of children's learning in primary and secondary, that the strategies that children need to learn are contextually specific. And early years is a little bit different because all of the areas of the curriculum are so very interwoven. But I think it can still be really helpful to explore the different areas of development that we're focused on, to think about what the specific self-regulation and metacognitive strategies are that are going to be useful in that context. So as a gap task before the next session, what I would love for you guys to do would be to explore the toolkit, have a look at self-regulation specifically, but also have a look at any other area that you know that you're working on at the moment, or that you know that your children have as a particular area for development right now, and think about how self-regulation might be able to contribute to that area. It may be that the toolkit has a specific reference to the importance of self-regulation in that area, or it may be that there are some inferences and some conclusions that you can draw if you look into the further research that is linked to in each of the areas of the toolkit as well. You'll definitely find it when it talks about specific areas to do with, you know, emotion, behavior, communication, literacy, and so on as well. And if you kind of compare and relate that to the report that we referenced as the gap task for this one, hopefully you'll be able to begin to build really you know, your contextualized and individual mental models for what self-regulation and metacognition need to look like in your setting. And as you said in your reflections from your breakout groups, how you're going to talk about it. What's the shared language that you're going to use when you're talking about self-regulation and metacognition where you are? So we've had a good chance to talk about how we will use that in our practice and where we're at now, and what we think we can celebrate. It was fantastic to hear the celebrations that people had and what we might be able to do moving forward as well. And in particular, I'd love for you to think about that, because next time we will talk a little bit about kind of implementation, how we think about, you know, when we've identified new strategies or ideas that we want to develop for our practice, how we go about doing that in a way that allows it to be effectively embedded as well. So I think you will get more out of the next session if you come with ideas of what you'd like to be working on and developing. So do use the early years toolkit, look at the self-regulation strategies in particular and the broader curriculum areas. As I said at the beginning, all of this will be available on the Padlet, which hopefully you all now have access to. We will eventually, by the end of the week, I think we'll share a recording of this session along with the slides from this session and all of the research and resources that we have referred to today as well. But if you would like to keep in touch in the meantime, there are some ways now on the screen for you to connect with the research school. Likewise, Fliss and I are both always really happy to be contacted and to kind of brainstorm or share ideas or resources that we have for any areas that you might want to be working on. Which means that I think with the 1 whole minute left to go, gives me the opportunity to say thank you again to everybody for coming today. I absolutely know how busy you are and really appreciate you carving out the time to talk about this with us. I hope that it has been useful for you and really look forward to seeing you next week. I think the date is completely wrong on there. I will see you on the 8th of December for our final session on self-regulation in the early years. And thank you to Fliss as well again for her expert insight.
Thanks, Polly. Thanks, everybody. Hope you all have a lovely evening and good rest of the week. Thanks so much.